Welcome back to Blender Daily. In today's video, I am going to show you how to add 3D models of cars to any of your videos with Blender. The special thing about this tutorial is that I'm going to do this entire project on a cloud computer. But don't worry, you can totally follow along with your own computer. You don't need to have a virtual machine. However, you could get a free trial version of a cloud computer on Renderro.com. They are also sponsoring this video, however they didn't tell me what to say or do, so everything I say about their product is my honest opinion. A cloud computer is basically a virtual machine that is located on a server, and all you need is a connection to the internet in order to access it. This allows you to get a lot of performance even if you are working on a really slow PC or laptop. Okay, so in order to access our computer, we just go to renderro.com. I already created a login in here, so you can then just go to the computers tab. Here I already have one computer, but for demonstration I'm just going to create a new one. First of all, you can give it a name, or you can use this button right here to just give it a random name. For example, Slippery Cameron. Sounds good. And then we can choose the configuration of our machine. So you can see we have 4 options to choose from. The basic option is already really good since it has 8 CPUs, 32 GB of RAM and 1 NVIDIA Tesla T4 GPU. So this basic option is already better than my local computer. And this goes all the way up to this turbo option, which comes with 48 CPUs, almost 200 GB of RAM, and 4 times a NVIDIA Tesla T4 GPU. So this is extremely good, but for this project, the basic option is already more than enough, so I'm just gonna go with this one. So let's continue, and we can select our drive. I'm just gonna go with the default one that I already created previously. Then I'm gonna select myself as the owner. Here we have a summary, and you can see that this will take about 5 to 10 minutes to set up our PC. This is only the first time that you create it. After that, you'll be able to turn it on and connect to it pretty fast with less than a minute. Yeah, I think that's all. So we can click on finish and wait a few minutes for this to set up. But in the meantime, I can show you how we can transfer files to our computers. So as you've seen, when I created the PC, I had to select the drive, and we can find this drive in the Drives tab over here. And here you can see all the files that I already uploaded. Those are files that we're going to use for our project. But if you want to upload a file, you can just click on Upload Files. Then get your file browser, and for example we could take this video file, just drag and drop it in here, upload one file, and after that we'll be able to access it from all our virtual computers. Okay, so the computer is now ready, and we can just click here in order to turn it on, and this will take a few seconds. Okay, so now it is turned on, and we can just click on Connect. And if this is your first time connecting, you just have to click down here and download the client to your computer. I already have it downloaded, so I just can click on Open, and it will open up my cloud computer. Alright, and now I'm in, and I have a brand new computer in front of me. It really feels as if I was using a regular PC. And it even uses both of my monitors, which I think is a really cool feature. But now, since this is a completely new computer, I first need to download Blender. Alright, so this is the footage that we're going to work with in this tutorial. You can download this with the link in the video description, and you'll get all the files that I use in this tutorial. So the first thing we need to do is to take this video file and convert it into an image sequence since it is way easier to work with image sequences in Blender than with actual video files. So in order to convert this, let's open up Blender, and we want to use a video editing workspace. So just open this up, then take our footage and drag and drop it into this timeline. So now we have this in here, and we can delete the audio file. Just select it and press delete, since we only need the video. You can see this is 458 frames long, so we also want to adjust our timeline to be 458 frames. Then further, I know that I recorded this in 4K, so I'm also going to adjust the resolution to 3840 by 2160. So we have this full resolution, and the frame rate is already set to 30 FPS, which is correct. And now this is scaled down a bit, so we just go to transform with the footage selected and bring this scale back up to 1. So now this fits perfectly. And yeah, I think those are already the basic settings. Also go to the output properties, and in the color management just make sure that this view transform is set to standard and not to filmic, because then we'll get wrong colors. We're going to use filmic later on once we bring in 3D elements, but for now we want to leave this on standard. Then we can go to the output settings. I want to export this as a PNG sequence. I don't need the alpha channel, so I switch this to RGB, and the compression settings are okay. Then just go in here, create an output folder for the sequence, and also give it a file name. I've already done this, so I'm not going to do it now. And once you set this output folder, you can just go up here, render, and choose render animation, and it will export your video file as an image sequence to the folder that you selected. This will take a few minutes, so I'm not going to do this now since I already have this image sequence in here. And you can see that it saves each frame as an individual PNG file. This will be very useful since this is a lot easier to work with image sequences in Blender. Now, as you can see, I have a regular image sequence with the PNG files, and I also have another one with JPEG files. And as you can see, they are only 300 kilobytes in size, which is also the reason why I created this. So the JPEG sequence is way smaller than the than the PNG sequence. And so the reason I have two sequences is the high resolution one with the big file sizes up to 8 megabytes per frame will be used for the motion tracking and for the final render. And the JPEG sequence is just for the playback, so we get smooth and real-time playback in Blender. So now I already showed you how to create this PNG sequence. In order to create a JPEG sequence, also create a new output folder and a new file name. Then switch the file format from PNG to JPEG. You can bring the quality down to 70% to get really low file sizes, and also bring down the resolution to 50% since we don't need this sequence to be in 4K. Then again, just go up here to render and choose render animation, and this time it should render way faster since it only has to export JPEGs. So once you've done that, we are ready to continue with the next step. So let's open up a new Blender file, up to File, New, and choose General. Don't save, and yeah, I recommend you to create a new file and don't use the video sequence editor. But if you do, just make sure that under color management you switch this back from standard to filmic, since now we want to use filmic in order to get realistic renders. We can delete this cube and the light as we don't need them. Then go to the output properties. We want to use 30 FPS. And we also want to bring the resolution up to 4K, 2160. Okay, so we have everything prepared. Let's just save this file so we don't forget to do this later on. And I'm just going to call this rec2. You can give it whatever file name you want. And then let's start with camera tracking. So in order to do a camera track, just go up here, create a new workspace, and under visual effects, choose motion tracking. Then let's close this up. So make this window a bit bigger and open up our PNG sequence. So this time we're going to use the high resolution image sequence that we have. Just go in here, press A to select all the PNGs and choose open clip. So now we have this video in here. Again, our timeline is only 250 frames long, however the clip is longer. So we just can click set scene frames and it will automatically adjust the timeline. And you can also press prefetch, which will oh yeah, it is working. Okay, so this will load in the whole footage into the memory and will make the tracking and playback of the video a lot faster. So just click prefetch and wait a few seconds until this is finished, and you will have way faster playback later on. So now this is already finished. However, you can see this this dark blue bar shows which frames are loaded into memory, and back here it is not loaded into memory, and so the playback is way slower. Now it didn't load in the whole footage into the memory, and if this happens for you, then just go up to Edit, Preferences, and to solve this issue, we need to go to System and increase this memory cache limit. So currently this is at 12,000, so let's maybe make this say 15,000. Save the preferences. And when I now click prefetch again, let's wait a moment, I think. Yeah, now it works and we have the whole footage in memory. You can scrub through it really quickly without any issues. Now what I see is that the last two frames are somehow black in my case. So I just the timeline to 458 frames. So I'm not going to use those last two frames. And yeah, so that's no problem at all. So if you don't know what camera tracking is, basically we're going to track a few contrast points in this footage. For example, we can use those points on the ground right here, those green leaves that are on the ground. Or, for example, we could use those screws or anything else that has a lot of contrast in the scene. We can place a tracker on it and follow it throughout the whole clip. If we have at least 8 of those trackers, we are then able to let Blender calculate the movement of the camera in 3D space, then apply this movement to our camera that we have in the 3D viewport, which will then allow us to bring in 3D objects, in this case a car, and make it look as if it was really in the scene. And now if you didn't understand this completely, don't worry. I will show you everything step by step and you should be able to follow along, and I'm sure you'll understand how everything works in the end. So let's start with tracking. First of all, I want to switch the motion model from location to affine, since I have a better experience with this and it usually gives me better results. I also want to enable normalize in order to get better results. And under tracking settings extra, I usually increase the margin to 5 pixels. So if the tracker gets close to the corner in a range of 5 pixels of our frame, it will stop tracking and avoid issues that might occur. So now that we have everything set, we can place our first tracker. And I think in the beginning I want to track this green leaf that we have right here. So in order to place a tracker, just hold down Control on the keyboard and left click where you want to place it. Now we have this tracker and we can press G to move it around, S to scale, and R to rotate. In this case, I think I want to scale it up a bit. And you can also press Alt S, which will bring up this outer frame, which is the range in which it is gonna look for this pattern that we have in our tracker. So I think I'm gonna scale this up a bit. And okay, now I'm on frame 120. I think it would be better if I start on the first frame. So I just go to the first frame, and by the way, you can use the shortcut Shift and left arrow or Shift and right arrow to quickly get to the first or the last frame. So now I go to the first frame, use G to place it on this green leaf. And now in order to start tracking, you could either use this button down here to track forwards or use the shortcut Ctrl T. You can also press L on the keyboard in order to lock the tracker to the view. And now you can see that this worked throughout the whole shot, which is perfect. So let's go back to the first frame and place another tracker, this time on this other leaf. Again, Control left click to place it, scale it up a bit, and Control T to start tracking. Now in this case, it stopped working at around frame 280, which is because our outer frame was too small. So we can just go in here, scale this up, and press Ctrl T again to continue with the track. And now it works until the end of the clip, which is great. So let's place another one. Let's go back to the first frame. This time I'm gonna use this leaf. Just find points of contrast in the scene and start tracking those points. Control T. And now we probably have the same issue again. Yet the outer frame is too small. So just increase the scale of it. Again, in order to see this outer frame, you need to use the shortcut Alt S to display it or turn it off. Again, adjust this, Control T. And let's continue tracking until the end of the clip. Let's go back to the first frame. Let's also track this leaf right here, scale it up, Control T. And probably the same issue again. Yep. Just scale up the frame, Control T to continue. And now this probably works pretty good. Yeah, that worked. So let's add another tracker, maybe on this screw right here. Scale it up a bit. And now you can see I'm on the last frame of our sequence. So when I press Ctrl T, it doesn't track because it can't track forwards. So this time we need to track backwards. And to do so, either use this button down here or the shortcut Ctrl Shift T to track backwards. Now we have this right here. Let's add another track. I also again go to the last frame. I'm gonna try to use this black dot right here. Scale it up a bit, Ctrl Shift T to track backwards. And that also worked. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 trackers. We need 8 in total for the camera track to work. So maybe let's add one right here. This dot. Control T. And that also worked. So we only need one more. Go back to the first frame. And when I tested this out, I think this black dot also worked. So let's try it. Scale it up, Control T. And no, it somehow lost this tracker. So let's delete it, go back. And maybe we could try to track this other dark part right here. Maybe this works better, Control T. And yet this one worked throughout the whole shot. You might think that it didn't track properly because it is wiggling around. However, this is no issue as long as the center point is staying in the same place. So it doesn't matter if those corners are moving around as long as the middle point is staying consistently in the same place, which it does. So we can leave this and we have our 8 trackers, so we can continue with the camera solve. So let me save the file with Ctrl S and switch to the solve panel. So first of all, let's also press N to open up the side panel, and under track, go to the camera settings. And here we can enter the sensor width of the camera that we recorded it with. I recorded this footage with an iPhone 8 and I googled the sensor width for iPhone 8 and I found out that this has a width of 4.6 millimeters. So I typed this in, which will help us a lot to get realistic results. If you know the focal length of your lens, you can also type this in right here. In this case, I don't know it, so I just leave this on what it is and enable focal length under refine, so Blender will try to estimate this. If you know the focal length, just type it in here and it will help you get better results in the camera solve. So the other thing that we need to set are the keyframes A and B. So basically we need to enter 2 keyframes between which there is a lot of parallax, which means that the camera is moving a lot between those 2 frames. So in this case we could use frame 1 for keyframe A, and for keyframe 2, let's forward a bit, maybe say for frame 320. So you can see the difference between 320 and frame 1, the camera is moving a lot. And this will help Blender create a good camera track. So once you have this set up, you can just click Solve Camera Motion and Blender will try to estimate the movement of the camera, which it did, and we have a solve error of an average of 0.48 pixels, which is extremely good. I'm happy with everything below 1 pixel error. So in this case, we got a really good camera track. If your result isn't that good, you might want to go through your trackers again and see if there are any errors. Maybe delete tracks that weren't good and create new ones. Or maybe also even add more than 8 trackers in order to improve this result. But in this case, this worked out pretty good, so let's continue. So for a long time, I also always use this Setup Tracking Scene button, which I can quickly show you what this does. So if I press Setup Tracking Scene, it will bring in those 2 objects, light, add our footage to the background of the camera. It also creates those collections, 2 view layers, and also a compositing node setup. However, I'm not really a fan of this. I prefer to do it manually since this gives me a lot more control. So I press Ctrl Z to go back and don't use this Setup Tracking Scene button in this tutorial. Instead, we're going to do everything manually. So just go back to Layout into our 3D viewport. Select the camera and we don't have any background image yet. So we can go to the camera settings. Or no, let's first go to the Object Constraint Properties and give it a camera solver. So now, when we scrub through the timeline, you should see the camera moving around. And it has exactly the same movement that I had when I recorded the footage with my iPhone. We can see even more if we go up to the overlay settings and enable motion tracking. You can see we get all those points, and those are basically 3D representations of those tracking markers that we placed in the scene. And they are now in 3D space. And you can see they stay in place and the camera is moving. So when we go into the camera, we can load in a background image. So let's go to the camera properties, background image, add image. We want a movie clip. And this time we're going to use the JPEG sequence, since this will give us real-time playback. Just select everything with the shortcut A open clip, and okay, now the issue, I think, is that, let's go back to the JPEG sequence. You can see that this is in the order that it starts with frame 460 and then goes down all the way to frame 1. However, in order to make importing image sequences work, I think I need to reverse this order. So I press this button down here. Now it starts with frame 1 and frame 460 comes in the end. So again, I press A, open clip, and now this works. Okay, so now we have this clip in here. Let's improve this a bit, because currently those points are just randomly floating in space. So let's go back into camera, select this point right here, and I want to make this the origin of our world. So I press 7, numpad 7 to get into top view, press G to place this point on the world origin. Let's make this exact, bring this in here, then numpad 1 to get into front view, and bring this all the way down to the origin, G set, place this right here. Okay, so now you can see that the world origin is here. However, we still have weird orientations and those points are still floating around. If we look at this, you can see that all those points right here should also be on the same plane as the world origin. So this one can be parallel to the origin. So we can go in here and with the camera selected, go to the pivot point menu and choose 3D cursor. When we now rotate, you can see our origin stays in place and the points and the camera are moving around. So we can go into top view with numpad 7, rotate this so that our point is aligned with the origin, go into front view and also rotate it so that it is placed on the ground plane. And now we have those 2 points that are exactly on the ground plane. However, if we take a look at this one, this should also be on the same plane as those 2 points. So when we go to side view, you can see that this is way below the surface. So again, just rotate the camera to bring this up to the ground. And now this is placed perfectly on the ground. And those other 2 points, see, yet they should also be placed on the ground. And if we take a look at this, you can see that they are exactly on the ground. So this worked out pretty good, and now we basically have this orientation and we can scrub through the timeline and everything seems to work pretty good. So let's bring in a ground plane. So I'm going to press Shift A and bring in a plane and scrub through the timeline. You can see that this plane really sticks to the ground. So let's go to the first frame, tab into edit mode, switch to edge selection and adjust this ground plane. So GY, move this over here, just so we cover the whole ground. Bring this over here. Maybe GX, adjust this a bit. This one as well, GX. Just align this with this corner. Then 2 and bring this edge over a bit. All right, so now I wanna project the texture of this parking lot onto this plane. So in order to do so, let's first switch to the viewport shading mode so we can see the material. Then also open up a shader editor. And maybe I think it is time to save the blend file so we won't lose our progress. And now in order to use the texture of the of the parking lot, just go to the JPEG sequence and bring in the first frame. Or no, first we need to create a new material, and then we can bring in the first frame. Plug the color into the color. And now you can see we have this texture, however, it is not mapped correctly. So in order to fix this, just tab into edit mode. Let's go to vertex selection. Press A to select all the vertices. Right click and choose subdivide. Do this a few times so that we have this plane subdivided. Then press U, again with everything selected, and make sure that you are on the first frame. U and choose project from view. And now we have this, this texture correctly projected onto this plane. We have those parking spots on our plane. I think this looks pretty good. We can also scrub through the timeline. And this sticks to the ground really good. Okay, so let's go back, and I think it is time to bring in the car. So for the car, let me show you this. I just went to blendswap.com when I was looking for a car that I could use for this tutorial. Then I searched for car. Blendswap is basically a website where you can get free blend files from other users that uploaded it. And I only wanted models that are licensed under the public domain, so I can use it for the tutorial. So I switch this to CC0, search blends, and in order to get good results, I sorted it by most downloaded. And here I chose the second one, this green car that we're going to use now. I already downloaded this, so you don't have to, and I made a few optimizations on the model and the materials. And this is also included in the downloads that you can get with the link in the video description. And there you should find this car.blend that we're going to use now. So let's jump back into Blender. Then just take this car.blend, drag and drop it into our scene. Choose append, collection. Select the car collection and choose append. Now we have this car in here. It is way too big, so let's scale it down. But you can see that this car consists of a lot of individual parts. So if we were to move them around or scale them down, we would have to do this with all of them individually. So in order to make this easier, I parented all of them to this empty. So you can just scale down this empty, and it will scale down all the objects together. So let's go in here, scale this down a bit, and place it in this parking spot. I also want to rotate this. Okay, we still have the 3D cursor set as our pivot point, so let's bring it back to median point. Now rotate it 180 degrees so that the front is facing to the camera. Let's place this in here. Let's take a look at it from the camera view. And I think maybe scale it up a bit. So go into front view and make sure that those wheels are exactly on the ground plane to make it look realistic. And yeah, now I think this looks pretty good. We can scrub through the timeline. And we have this car in here. Okay, so we can already continue with the next step, which is going to be the lighting and preparing for the rendering. So we can go to the render preview. Now currently, okay, we are still in Eevee. We don't want to use Eevee for this project since yeah, a lot of the things that we're going to do later on only work with cycles, and this project wouldn't work in Eevee, so we're going to use cycles instead. I also want to go, or no, let's first make a add realistic reflections to our car. And for this, I already created a 360-degree panorama image that you can see right here. I created this when I recorded the footage. I made this with the Google Street View app. It is really easy to use, and you can quickly create this 360-degree panorama. And we can now use this and wrap this around our 3D objects in order to get realistic reflections on the car. So let me show you how to do this. Just go to the world properties. Under color, add in an environment texture. Open an image and select the 360-degree JPEG. So when I open this up, you can see we now have the 360-degree panorama image in the back, which will give reflections to our car. Now the rotation of the panorama image isn't correct, so let's fix this. For this we need to open up a shader editor, switch this from object to world, press Shift A, and under input bring in a texture coordinate node. I'm going to use the generated coordinates in the vector, and also press Shift A, and under mapping, I guess. Oh no, vector mapping. Here it is, the mapping node. And now we can just play with this set rotation until this is lining up correctly. And I think this should be around -45 degrees. Yeah, so I think this is about right. This doesn't have to be perfect because it is only in the reflections. However, I think it is good to adjust this rotation a bit. Okay, so we can close this shader editor. We don't need it anymore. Okay, now I closed it. And in our final render, we don't want to see this panorama in the background. So in order to turn this off, let's go to the render properties and under film, enable transparent. So now we have transparency in the background. And yeah, we can't see this really good, but we have a transparency issue if we look through those windows, because here we can see the 360-degree panorama and not the footage that we want instead in this background. So we also turn on transparent glass, and now we can see through those windows. So yeah, we have fixed that. However, the next issue is that we don't have any realistic lighting in the realistic lighting and shadows. This is because this panorama that we imported is not an HDRI. It is only a JPEG and doesn't have enough dynamic range in order to light our objects. It is good enough for the reflections, but we can't use it for the lighting. So instead, we're going to press Shift A and under light bring in a sun lamp, which will get us way better shadows. Let's press GZ and bring it up a bit. And you can see that we now have really hard shadows, which is way better and looks more realistic in this scene. You can also compare this to the shadow that we have on the left here, which is a lot harder. And yeah, but we also need to match the direction of the shadow. So we can rotate the sun a bit to make it about the same. No, I don't think this rotation is correct yet. So let's go into top view. Maybe switch to the material preview. And what I find worked pretty good is I took the sun, moved it over here, and rotated it so that it aligns exactly with this shadow that we have right here to get the correct angle for the sun. And when we now go back into rendered view, yeah, this looks pretty good, and we have the correct angle for the sun, and we get correct shadows. So I think that's it for the lighting. This looks pretty good. So let's continue with the next step. And as you can see, we also don't want to have this plane in the final render. We only want the shadows that are casted onto this plane. So in order to do so, we can just go to the object properties and under visibility, turn on shadow catcher. So now we can only see the shadows that are casted onto this plane, but not the plane itself, which is really good in this case and exactly what we want. So yeah, you might think that this shadow is way too soft now. However, we're going to fix this later on in the compositor, and we're also going to fix the color of the shadow in order to make this look more realistic. So for now, I think we're already ready to prepare the scene for rendering. So first of all, we need to set up our view layers. So we want to have a separate view layer for the shadow only, and another view layer for the foreground, which is going to be only the car. So let's first rename this plane to shadow catcher, just to organize it a bit. Let's also create a new collection and call this also shadow catcher. Shadow catcher. Bring this plane in here. And now, as I said, we want to have two view layers. So the current one, let's call this foreground. Foreground, this one is going to be only for the car. And I also want to rename this collection to foreground to make it a bit clearer. Then let's create a new view layer. Just click here, new. And this one we're going to call shadow catcher. So this one is only going to be for our shadow catcher. So currently we are in the shadow catcher view layer. So we can disable the foreground elements in here. So to do so, we select this foreground collection, right click on it, and under view layer, set indirect only. So now we still get the shadow from the objects, but not the car itself. And if I disable those overlays, you can see that what we're going to render out later on, which is going to be only the shadows for this layer. And let's turn this back on and switch to the foreground layer. And for this one, we want to turn off the shadows. So we select the shadow collection, right click on it, and under view layer, change this to set indirect only. And now here we only have the car, and this is what we're going to render later on. So now I also want for the foreground collection, so make sure you are in the foreground view layer. Go to the view layer properties and enable denoising data, so we can denoise this layer later on in the compositing process. So yeah, now we're ready to make our first render and start with the compositing. So let's go to the rendering tab and maybe also adjust a few rendering settings. So first of all, I want to enable adaptive sampling to speed things a bit up. I think 128 samples is enough. I also want to switch the device to GPU compute. Since this is a lot faster, I have a Tesla T4 GPU in this cloud computer, as you can see here, which is extremely fast. And on the performance, since I'm using a GPU, I also want to increase the size of those tiles. So let's say 256 pixels. If you don't have a GPU, just leave this at CPU. It will work the same. And but if you're using a CPU, I wouldn't recommend you to increase those tile sizes. Just leave it at a small value. Then also in the output settings, I want to bring the resolution to 50% for now. since we're only gonna use this render now for the compositing. For the final render, I'm gonna bring this back up to 100% and render in 4K. So I think that's everything we have to set. So once you're ready, press F12 and start rendering. And yeah, this will take a second to prepare the scene. And then it starts to render the foreground layer, which is our car. And then continues with the background, the shadow catcher right here. So now you can see it rendered those two layers. We can switch between them up here, the foreground and the shadow catcher. So in order to combine them and add the background in again, we need to go to the compositing workspace. Let's close this timeline for now. So this side panel, and I want to have an image editor in here. Switch this to the viewer node so we can see our composite right away. Then enable use nodes and disable the backdrop. For now, I'm gonna disconnect the composite node and move it to the side. We're gonna use that later on, but for now I wanna use only the output viewer layer. No, just viewer node, so that we can see what we are doing right here in the image editor. So we also need to duplicate this this render layer. The first one is going to be the shadow catcher, and the second one the foreground. And the other input node that we need is going to be a movie clip node. Just go to input, movie clip. Now for me, it automatically loaded in our footage. If that didn't happen for you, just go to open clip and select the PNG sequence. So now when we take a look at this clip or this image, you can see that this is bigger than our render layers. This is because previously in the output settings, we set the output to 50%, which scaled down our render layers, but it didn't do this for the movie clip. So we need to fix this with distort scale node. Plug this in here and change it from relative to render size. So it will always be adjusted automatically to the render size. And now this scale is correct. So let's first composite in the shadows. For this, we're going to need a color. No, it is right here. Converter color ramp node. Plug the alpha into the input. We're not going to use the image output. We're going to use the alpha output right in here. And let's take a look at this. So first of all, what I notice is we need to flip this color ramp so that the shadows are black. And we have a lot of noise in here. So in order to improve this, we can bring in a filter denoise node right here, and this will smooth everything out, as you can see here. Make it a lot better. So let's combine this with our movie clip. For this, we're going to use a color mix node, the footage into the top input and the color ramp into the bottom one, then into the viewer node so we can see the result. And take a second. It didn't work because we need to switch this from mix to multiply. And now this should work. Yeah, it does. Okay, as I already mentioned previously, this shadow is way too soft and too bright. And it also has the wrong color. So improve this. We're gonna bring in a color RGB curves node and just bring down the brightness right here to make the shadow a bit darker. Yeah. Then we can also bring in this stop a bit to make it even more dark. All right, and now to give it this bluish color, again, go to Shift A, color, and use a color balance node right here. Now we want to compare this with the shadow that we have over here in order to make our shadow look real. So you can see this shadow is really bluish and our shadow is completely black. So just in the color balance, bring this lift color to a blue value. Let's just try this here, wait a moment to update. And I think this already looks pretty good. This is about the same blue. So I think we can continue with this. Okay, so let's bring in our car. Right here. Bring the composite node out of the way. And since we enabled the denoising data for this render layer, we now have this denoising outputs, noisy image, denoising normal, and denoising albedo, which will give us a really good denoising result with the filter denoise node. Just plug those in here. And then mix this output with the rest of our composite. And for this, we're going to use a color alpha over node, the previous composite into the top input, and the denoise node into the bottom input. And let's wait a second to update. Here we have our car. I think this already looks pretty good, but there's one last thing that I want to do. Just gonna be Shift A, color, and bring in another RGB curves node just to slightly increase the contrast on this final image, and then also connect the final output with the composite node so that we can render this out later on. So let me quickly show you the final node setup. If you didn't get along, or if you missed a part or something, or you just want to take a look at it again, right here. And this is our final render. We have now done this with one frame. We're going to render out the animation later on, but for now you can just go through it, choose any frame you like, go to rendering, press F12 to render, and it will render all the layers and composite everything together. And yeah, before you do an animation render, I would recommend you to just go and pick maybe 3 or 4 frames throughout the whole animation and render them, just to see if there are any issues you want to solve before doing the final render. So now it's rendered the foreground layer. Now the background with the shadows. And then it will composite everything together. Okay, so that's it for now. I'm gonna take a quick break, and then I'm gonna come back to you and show you how to render this as an animation. And as always, don't forget to save your file. Okay, so let's finish this up and render the animation. So for this, we're gonna go to the output properties, and for the file format, we're gonna use PNG again, since we're gonna export this as an image sequence. So instead of RGBA, we're going to use RGB, leave the compression settings, and we also need to create the output folder. I'm going to place this on the desktop. I already called it render, and for the file name, I'm just going to type in car and accept. So once you have this set up, you can just go up here and on the render, choose render animation, or use the shortcut Ctrl F12. I'm not going to do this now because I already rendered a few hundred frames of this animation. So I'm now going to show you, or let's first open this up. You can see that I have this image sequence. It's not this one. Oh yeah, the render. I already rendered 260 frames. So you can see once you rendered it out, you'll get all those PNGs. And now we can combine them back into a video file. So in order to do so, let's first save our blend file. Then go to File, New, and open up a video editing workspace. Now we need to import our image sequence. So we go down here to add, choose image sequence, then go to wherever you saved it, to my render folder, press A to select all the files, and choose add image strip. So now we have this in here. You can see I didn't export the full clip, but it is basically the same process. So now again, this is 259 frames, so we need to adjust the timeline, 259. Then to export it as a video file, go to the output settings, and for the file format, choose FFmpeg video. The encoding, we can choose a preset, which is going to be the MP4. Again, select an output folder. I'm going to save this to the desktop and just call this car VFX. Accept, and yeah, we'll need to set the frame rate to 30 FPS, but otherwise I think everything should be set up. Okay, so let's start rendering. Just go up here, render animation, and this will take a few seconds. Alright, so my render just finished. So let's take a look at it. I have saved it to the desktop. So it should be this one. And yeah, I think this looks pretty good. I'm happy with the result. I hope you could follow along with this tutorial. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to ask me in the comments. Alright, so that's it for this video. As I already mentioned, this tutorial was recorded entirely on a virtual computer from Renderro. This was their cheapest machine, and the performance was already more than sufficient for this project. I think you can imagine how powerful their best option must be, which includes 4 Tesla T4 GPUs, almost 200 GB of RAM, and 48 CPUs. If you are interested, you can get a free trial of their service with $10 of credit included to try it out and convince yourself. I am Nick from Blender Daily. See you in the next one.